Welcome everyone to Materia. This is the spring quarter of 2021. We are very happy, very fortunate to have with us today two very esteemed colleagues, McKenzie Wark and Orlando Bentancor. I'm going to introduce the event today, tell folks a little bit about the group and about why we're having this conversation today. We are a cozy 43 participants with a few others coming in. The first thing I'd like to say, of course, is thank you to our speakers and to everyone who's joining. Materia has been working on anthropocentric thought, Latin Americanist and otherwise, since 2014. We have a series of events that range from grad students, work in progress presentations to distinguished outside guests, local Stanford faculty. There have been a number of books and dissertations and courses connected to Materia over the years. This particular year, we are tackling the notion of political ecology from various perspectives. Our first event this quarter and this year, before our second event today, was devoted to discussing Guattari's The Three Ecologies in connection to Juan Cárdenas' Ornament or Ornamento, and of course, in light of the problem of political ecology. Today, we have an invitation to Donna Haraway's California, to two New York intellectuals hailing from Australia and Uruguay. I think that in itself is a very interesting configuration, of course, supported by networks, by hardware, that we can also think about. Orlando Bentancor is a repeat invite of Materia. He presented on his work in November 2017, at that time with Laurie Palmer from UC Santa Cruz. It's great to have Orlando back. We have pre-circulated an interview that McKenzie Wark had with Alexander Galloway. I wasn't sure who was interviewing whom. It ended up being a really lively conversation and a panorama of her very rich work. One thing that McKenzie has done in, I think, a central book for Materia, that would be Molecular Red, is to show how new materialism invites reconsiderations of the historical materialist archive. New materialism invites reconsiderations of the historical materialist archive. The connection there with Bentancor's work is that Bentancor's work does something similar, to the extent that new materialism there invites reconsiderations of colonial sources. So hailing, before historical materialism had come into its own, in Orlando's work, Aristotelian Thomism is the baffling conceptual backbone of colonial extractivism. It might be unfamiliar to the two of you, even though you're closer geographically, but your work read together resonates quite a bit with this research group. It makes a lot of sense when thinking about new materialism and historical materialism together, when trying to revise archives in light of problems that were always there, but we didn't have eyes to see them. There are differences, of course, in your approaches, in your stages in the academic career. McKenzie has done enormous contributions to low theory. And this is something that I want to read more in the latest book. It's something that has been coming into its own. I'm going to cite from the interview here before I do a very short presentation of your publications. Says McKenzie Wark, "My job is to corrupt other people's grad students, to be the odd uncle or auntie who whispers that one can descend from the great academic patriarchy and even its subsidiary matriarchy, where one only succeeds through obedience to the elders and the reproduction of their thought." This is an invitation to do just that, right? To corrupt our grad students in modern thought and literature, feminist gender and sexuality studies, Iberian and Latin American cultures, comparative literature, and the whole host of Materia connections. We have here already 44 participants from across Stanford, English, Complit, ILAC, you name it. Mostly grad students, but also colleagues from Stanford and other institutions. McKenzie Wark is the author of, I'll mention just 4 essential titles: Molecular Red, 2015, Philosophy for Spiders on the Low Theory of Kathy Acker, 21. Haven't read it yet, looking forward to reading it. A Hacker Manifesto, very influential, from 2004. Gamer Theory from 2007. She teaches at Eugene Lang College and the New School in New York City. Orlando Bentancor is an associate professor at Barnard College in Colombia. He received his BA in philosophy from Universidad de la República in Uruguay, his PhD in Romance Languages and Literature from Michigan in 2005. He's also taught at University of Southern California. He had a visiting appointment in Princeton in comparative literature. And his book that I alluded to earlier, The Matter of Empire, Metaphysics and Mining in Colonial Peru, is quite the milestone. His present work is on Andean water wars and cultural conceptions of water. He has published in a number of prominent journals within the field. Here's how we're going to proceed going forward. McKenzie is going to lead with a short presentation with roughly 30 minutes, give or take. Orlando is going to respond over 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Again, welcome. It's so very nice to have you here.
Thank you, Hector. My thanks to Materia, and also especially to Orlando. I wanted to start with thinking about the 2 sort of keywords that were sort of structuring the symposium, which was ecology and politics. And I think I just sort of a little bit as a provocation thought, well, what if we talk about non-politics and non-ecology and sort of think a little bit outside of those terms and how we end up with, I'm always curious how we end up with certain words and how we get, sort of how they become attractors for certain kinds of work. So I have a few thoughts on non-ecology, then some on non-politics, and I'm from media studies, so we're going to come back to technics as the third of those. Or I don't think there's a non-technics, but maybe we can think about that a little bit together. So non-ecology, I was influenced by Tim Morton's book, Ecology Without Nature, but it just made me want to think about nature without ecology. I thought that there were a lot of affordances to the word nature that weren't really covered by that. Raymond Williams, in magnificent book Keywords, describes nature as one of the 2 or 3 most complex words in the English language. Interestingly, the other word he says that about in the same volume is culture. But to just stick with nature, and from memory, it does say 2 or 3 most complicated. I love that little ambiguity as well. And the thing is that nature means various things that aren't actually compatible with each other at all. It's this like wonderfully open, flexible kind of term. It can be something that includes the human as part of it, but it can also mean that which the human excludes. So it's already on either side of its own dialectic, if you like. It's a term and its own negation at the same time. So nature struck me as having all sorts of possibilities, as being a kind of category that gets articulated by particular practices in particular ways, and it has this kind of rich history and a history that's in multiple European languages as well. So rather than ecology, I want to think about nature, and also wanted to engage with problems of naturalism in how we create concepts. And one of the things I've decided to actively dislike is the notion of everything being socially constructed. To my mind, this comes out of Berger and Luckman and is a sort of foundational figure for a certain kind of sociology, but which sort of started to run amok and it's become sort of politically weaponized as well, and particularly in relation to gender. So according to gender critical feminists, and it's even in that term, the problem with trans people is that they're just doing gender as a social construct, as if that meant nothing, whereas sex is biological and hence natural. So nature gets caught up there in a series of associations that excludes the possibility of me being a person. So I wanted to sort of return to the figure of nature rather than ecology, and open it up and open up the complicated etymology of it, where it's meant everything and its opposite. And that the additional thought is that the way that term is articulated might have more to do with the practice that's articulating it than anything else. So yeah, what happens if we think the figure of nature as not something completely subsumable into the social or entirely separate from it? And that was where I was going in Molecular Red. In that book, I really wanted to engage with the strand of Marxism that came out of the natural sciences, and where what Marxism would be was thought through practices in the natural sciences. Now I'm thinking of J.D. Bernal and Joseph Needham, J.V.S. Haldane, and figures like that. It strikes me that every sort of Marxist reshapes that tradition in the image of the labor practice they themselves happen to be involved in. And among people who had academic backgrounds, you end up with a philosophical Marxism, a social science Marxism. There was also a natural science Marxism, and we sort of lost the thread of that one a bit. And I think because it was particularly vigorously attacked during the Cold War, and it disappears in the Cold War. And there's sort of faint traces and echoes of it in things like science studies. Most of the major figures in science studies have won the Bernal Prize, named after J.D. Bernal, but whom they rarely refer to in their, with the acceptances I've been able to find online. There's a sort of, like almost, we could almost say a hauntology in relation to the Marxist origins of science studies. But I was kind of interested in the way that there was a sort of thinking through of what materialism would mean through natural science practices, and particularly in relation to life sciences. Someone like Bernal was on the border between physics and what will become biochemistry. Needham was a biochemist. And Needham goes on to write a 20-volume work on science and technology in China as a whole second career, like truly astonishing figure. Why we don't talk more about Needham is a great mystery to me. So yeah, I'm a little resistant to the way that in the humanities we end up constructing our own version of knowledge as the sovereign one that gets to criticize the others, where that's never reciprocal. So I want to hang on to nature and to dialogue with practices of labor and knowledge where nature is in play. I don't want to say object because I don't think that's quite accurate, and we might come back to that if there's a minute. I think my problem with the term ecology is it's usually linked to homeostasis, to some idea of a completable cycle. And I think that might be something useful to sort of think without, that maybe the kind of instability of whatever ecology is trying to think might be a thought we have to open the door to. And I think where Tim Morton's thought was going was to think ecology without nature, meaning there's practices that need to be created to create something that would approximate homeostasis. And to some extent, I understand that as an important project. And I think there's a friendly dialogue that I'm having with Tim. But maybe we have to address the fact that homeostasis is not a thing that on a planetary scale that nature does, and that we're certainly heading into a period of kind of massive instability. And that's sort of exactly what the Anthropocene means, that we're now at that moment when geological time is probably happening faster than historical time. And so one has to reverse the order in which they're thought. I think of Braudel, right? And the idea of like the deep time of climate that shapes the Mediterranean. It's like, actually now that's the other way around. There's sort of this immovable, sort of the practico inert of historical time that we can't make move fast enough to keep up with a geological time. So maybe one has to reverse that. And and call the Anthropocene what you like. I honestly don't care, but there's a lot of debates about calling it something else. It's known as Anthropocene to people in the natural sciences. So if you want to have the dialogue, it's kind of useful to speak the language. But call it something else if you like in your particular language community. But that would be the meaning that I would give to it, is that reversal of historical time and geological time, which may have happened before for those peoples that have some memory of what the late Pleistocene was like and what the transition into the Holocene was like. There's certain indigenous populations in Australia that seem to me to have, and I'm just reading the anthropology, and this is not my field at all, but where there seems to be reliable knowledge from before the Holocene. That's maybe not universal, but there may be other places that we have that. And that might start to matter, like where are the practices of knowledge that actually traverse the whole of the Holocene and give us some sense of what it was like to transition in geological time. So in a way, I guess, what I'm arguing for, everybody does Marx plus somebody else. It's interesting how Marx always has to have supplements. And really, maybe one positions oneself by choosing the supplement. And the supplement I want to choose is Lucretius. So what would a Lucretian Marxism look like? John Bellamy Foster, I think, has already suggested that. In fact, my work on Bogdanov in Molecular Red came out of a suggestion in John Bellamy Foster, who seemed to me to have read, because it's a very comprehensive book, but read a little quickly through certain other pathways where we could go. And I picked Bogdanov out of that and read that more deeply to sort of try to figure out, and you know, de rere natura, like the nature of things, is Lucretius's summation of Epicurean thought, right? And the practice of knowledge in that struck me as a useful one, and one that one could see at work even in Marx's own work. You know, Marx's doctoral thesis was actually on the Epicureans, right? And a chunk of it's about Lucretius. And also, again, not a thing I'm a specialist in, but Marx seems to have intuited some things we know from fragments that were discovered after Marx's time. So maybe there's a way of thinking the figure of nature in a philosophy of practice, or and I think philosophy of practice is a little different to process philosophy. Maybe we can come back to that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about non-politics, and that'll give us a way to think about practices. And I have a little bit of, I'm a little bit to the side of new materialism, and we'll sort of come at why that's not how I describe what I do. But yeah, what we mean by non-politics, just as I'm suspicious of making the social a sovereign category, I'm suspicious of that gesture that makes the political the sovereign category that explains all of the others. And it's interesting, the third version of that is everything's cultural, but that seems not to be as fashionable as it was 20, 30 years ago. I came up through cultural studies where everything was cultural, and then over in sociology, everything was social. Over in political science, in the sort of more theoretical end, everything was becoming political. And there's ways in which, where those folks were Marxists, it was thought through struggles that would happen in superstructures that were relatively autonomous from struggles at the base, whatever the material base of production was. And I think the work I've been doing, particularly in Molecular Red and since, is kind of a critique of my own formation as a culturalist version of Marxism, to sort of think, you know what, to be more vulgar about it and to think forces of production, relations of production, and particularly the interface between forces of production and what those retrospectively nominate as nature, in inverted commas, is maybe the object. So to not center either culture or the social or the political, and to remind ourselves that Marxism is not a political theory, never was. Politics is a dependent category. It's determined by something else. What it's determined by is class struggle at the face of production. We might want to expand and open up how we think that in the 21st century. So it became a little all-embracing. Everything is political. I'm always fascinated by why intellectuals are so drawn to the category of the political. And is it because we imagine it's something we could actually do? Whereas we lack the sort of specialized knowledge to engage directly with, for example, with techniques and things like that. I think that's misguided, and the number of academics or scholars who've ever been good at politics is incredibly small. And we tend not to have that skill set, which is why we end up fighting managers in our own universities, because we're actually bad at this. We tend not to have the particular kind of charismatic power, nor do we have that administrative decisionism that's like the other version of this. Like, we tend not to be good at it, but somehow we want to make it central. I love the fact that everybody in the academic world complains about actual politics being banal and hopeless, and yet reserving hope for the category of the political. Why do we do that? Like that, I find that very striking, that actual politics is unsatisfying, that there's always a sort of utopian version that we want to sort of latch onto that's other. And it's a kind of dimension that's not granted to certain other practices. Like, we rarely admit there could be that affordance or utopian possibility to the technical. The technical just is, and it's bad. Whereas the political, well, yeah, the actual politics is bad, but we reserve the right for there to be this other kind that we can imagine but can't actually practice. Anyway, so that would be also my self-critique of, as someone who is cadre trained to be a political militant, and figured out I actually lacked most of the skills and ended up in academia. Maybe politics doesn't really capture and my notes is nature of power, and I'll leave that word there, I think, or nature of powers, plural. And maybe we got a little distracted by the later Foucault talking about biopolitics, when the earlier Foucault was really interesting on the capillary actions of power. And I read Foucault as being about techniques. The techniques of the clinic, the techniques of the prison, the techniques of classification and organization. That struck me as a lot more interesting, and particularly the way that those things actually don't really depend all that much on a centralized state agency. I was sort of very much at odds with the Gramscian political theory of that era, and getting us really to the base. There's a way in which we could even do a vulgar Marxist reading of Foucault as being about the base of the actual production of power at the molecular level. And maybe that would be useful to sort of branch out from centering the political as a category to look at things that aren't the workplace, but are parallel to the workplace in being base, not superstructure, or infrastructure, as one might now say. And it has to be said, we lose sight of how politics as a category is something we get out of Greek lineage. That might not really describe how power works elsewhere at all. Surely one would center, for example, China is something one would try to understand at the moment. Is the political even an adequate category for understanding how power works there? I don't know. I think it's a question worth asking. Given that there's a very different modern history in relation to relation between state and nation and so on, and state, nation, and party. And then my other sort of critique of the political as category is it traditionally was exclusionary. As Kathiakis says, women, slaves, and beasts are excluded from consideration altogether. And I don't know that the liberal project of inclusion in it has ever succeeded or can now succeed, which is a thing we would learn, for example, from Afro-pessimism, yeah? That the kind of exclusion and othering of certain categories of being might be permanent and structural, and the dream of inclusion might never come to be. Not Afro-pessimists, but I'm interested in Merton and Harney's juxtaposition of something against politics, which maybe is called the surround. And there's interestingly spatial and also sonic and non-visual way that's thought in texts that they've written together. So if we're not thinking politics so much, we could center other categories. I worked on Guy Debord quite a bit because I like the way Du Bois thought not about politics at all, but about war, and is a very interesting reader of Clausewitz and military strategy. Even designed a game to teach strategy to militants. So maybe we could think politics as war by other means, which also connects the legacy of the Black Panthers. That was one of the lessons I think that they were working on. And Honey picked this up of really politics wasn't what they were doing at all. So maybe we could think about war and war not just in relation to bodies of usually men, right, fighting each other, but war in relation to nature, war in relation to extraction, war in relation to other parts of the biosphere besides merely the human. So maybe that's the category that one could expand in place of always expanding the political. And that's interesting to me why intellectuals are drawn to the category of politics, but not to war, and what's involved in that choice, at least for those of us of generations that weren't directly exposed to them in parts of the world where there weren't wars we had to be exposed to. That's a historically variable experience. And I think particularly in settler colonial situations to sort of push back on the category of the political. I think I don't want to impose that on anybody else. I think that really in relation to my own experience as an Australian, that it seemed that the social democratic project was redeemable there up to a point. But you could never really overcome the settler colonial origins of the state within which you were attempting some sort of kind of Gramscian struggle. There's certain things that are foundational to it that are now very clear there, such as that the mining industry owns both of the major political parties at this point. So there's nothing to be gained for on that front for voting for one or being active in one versus the other. All right, so rather than think, so to think ecology, to think nature again rather than ecology, to think war rather than politics, and to reinscribe technics as a category. I'm from media theory, so I'm from media theory Marxism. So, and to me, those things are very much relatable as being about form of relation and the materiality of form of relation. To me, that would be what connects my particular brand of Marxism and media theory together. Why is technics always made dependent on some other term? The sociology of science and technology always wants to insist that technologies are socially constructed, but then you never get to quite see how the social is technically constructed. There's a lack of reversibility of the terms. And I think one also has to ask why techniques as a category is not really thinkable in certain kinds of philosophy. And Bernard Stiegler, I think, was really interesting as a thinker on that. But my answer to that is kind of a lot more vulgar, in that if you're building a kind of theoretical conceptual edifice based on the work of slave owners, there's certain things it's just not going to have in it. And so that encounter of labor with the tool, with the thing that will retrospectively get constructed as nature by the action of the labor and tool combined, then it's never going to quite emerge as a concept. And I think maybe we're still a little bit stuck with that in some branches of humanities and social science. So I'd like to center techniques a little more, and where we can then start to think that maybe the human was always technical and that there's no real separation between those two things. That's a sort of really magic gift of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, yeah, is to think cyborg is human and technic, but it does leave you with this sense of it being something novel, when maybe it's not, and maybe there's a way in which technics kind of precedes the human on a very, very long timescale. Going back to the Pleistocene, maybe we were technical before we were human would be the thing. I'm not an archaeologist, but it seems to me that the hand and the tool co-evolved rather than, oh, look, we have opposable thumbs, now we can have tools. Like, that version of the story never made sense to me. Central figure in media theory, you kind of never gets taken seriously anywhere else because he was actually really good at media, and that always sort of undermines your credibility, is McLuhan. But McLuhan always thought media, and I'm thinking media and techniques a little interchangeably here, and in this very dated language, McLuhan would say, as media is an extension of man. And that's the very thing I'm trying to reverse here. And to think maybe techniques as extensions into and productive of categories of the human, and then categories also of what's excluded from the human. So to center not so much techniques in the sense of its artifactual components, but to think techniques and labor together. And I think the thing that often gets left out of readings of Haraway's cyborg texts is it's centrally about labor and ways of thinking labor and techniques together. To me, that's the figure of the cyborg, is a laboring meat and machine, is cyborg. And as Haraway will later make a little clearer, it includes other species. So what's the matrix of species and techniques combined that we might think labor a little bit as interwoven and always already technical. The thing is, though, the human is that which techniques make appear as free of techniques. The thing about techniques is its invisibility, like it's meant to conceal an effort or reduce an effort so that you no longer think that effort would have to be there. Once you've got one of those electric drills, you forget what it was like turning a screw by hand or trying to drill a hole in the wall. I moved apartments, and I was like laboriously like screwing things with a hand screwdriver, and the TaskRabbit guy just comes along, and I'm like, oh, but now I have one of those and I've completely forgotten, like the labor has gone away. It's no longer visible to me. And a lot of labor is historically now invisible to us because of the layers of techniques that hides itself from us and makes it appear as if the human is a thing when the human is actually sort of derivative artifact. So it's a way of actually thinking Marxist-based and superstructure or vulgar Marxism more deeply on a much longer historical time frame to see the human itself as superstructural to our techniques, if you like, as an artifact. And while I've been emphasizing maybe there's a non-ecology or a non-politics, I don't know if there's a non-technics or if it's helpful to think it. I mean, I'm sure you could imagine one. And I think it's sort of media theory 101 to sort of propose, what if there's no non-technics? What if everything is kind of produced as an artifact of it? So one thing I'm hinting at is that maybe conceptual categories are derivatives of labor processes, where those labor processes are always cyborg in nature, but have particular forms of organization and so forth. So maybe one has to do a kind of critique before one does anything else, which is to sort of try to uncover the labor process that's masked by whatever the concept is. And to do this in, if necessary, in the most vulgar way, that the category of politics masks the necessity of slavery to make politics possible, and to not lose track of that thought, for example. And I got this a little bit out of Alexander Bogdanov, who was sort of Lenin's rival for leadership of the Bolshevik Party. And there's this whole version of Marxism that got forgotten because Lenin had anathemized it, which to me seems like a good reason to revive it, yeah? And of the two, Lenin was trained as a lawyer and Bogdanov in natural sciences and in physiology and medicine. And it's like, oh, that seems to me to be more interesting, and had sort of grasped that one of the problems for the labor movement was how to organize knowledge. How would knowledge be organized after the revolution is a Bogdanovite question. And how can it be organized in advance of that? Bogdanov thought that overthrowing capitalism was the least of our problems. The organization of knowledge and labor on a planetary scale in relation to nature was the problem that Bogdanov thought was absolutely central and would take a lot longer to work out. The thing that the Anthropocene forces on us is we sort of have to do those things in reverse. or in parallel, and just kind of figure out what would be an organization of knowledge that doesn't make one version of knowledge sovereign over the others, that doesn't treat particular concepts as determinate concepts, where it's possible to think of a democratic or perhaps even comradely relation between different forms of knowledge practice, rather than doing that thing where we're kind of assured to ourselves and the people who do the same kind of knowledge that somehow it's sovereign and somehow has the answers. So what would be a kind of another practice of theory and knowledge is, and that's a question I kind of picked up after molecular red, that's in sensoria and general intellects. What's, you know, if we no longer have, you know, the sort of the Jean-Paul Sartres, no, usually white guys, right? This kind of universalizing intellectuals with grand worldviews, but maybe rather than public intellectuals, we have general intellects. People who know that what they're doing is generalizing out of a particular labor process and then looking for the lateral connection to be able to build networks of knowledge and labor that might be endurable, that might see to it that more of the world endures. So I think that's all a little different to new materialism, because the thing I want to make central is praxis. So there was sort of an internal struggle within Marxism as to whether dialectical materialism or historical materialism was the central conceptual core of it. There is no dialectical materialism in Marx or Engels. It's a term that never appears. It gets constructed later as a kind of meta discourse. So I'm clearly team historical materialism in that sense, which is to always ask how knowledge practices come out of forms of labor and are thus historically contingent. So there's no sort of universalizing or ontologizing discourse, because sometimes new materialism reminds me of that, of wanting to sort of describe a nature through a contemplative practice, drawing on at second order knowledges of practice and labor, but then retrospectively claiming that there's some concept only we can generate out of whatever that is. So scratch new materialism, you find developments in the natural sciences in the post-war period over and over again, but as if they're independently discovered by contemplation. And that seems to me to erase the labor that produced the possibility of thinking. Symbiosis, for example, you know, this is based on actual labor that Margulies and others actually performed. So I'm a little resistant to the ontologizing turn in that sense. So to me, everything is praxis, everything is labor. So I think maybe I'll leave it there with the hint of a comradely, a possibility of a comradely relation between forms of knowledge, labor, techniques that might, in the margins of a political economy we still have to deal with, be able to construct the very hint of something that might make life endure, that might give us some sense of ongoingness, because where we are with the Anthropocene is that we may be losing that. I get the sense that possible futures are kind of disappearing on a daily basis at the moment. So the work we might have to do isn't ecological in that sense. It's to do with what can be held together through what's probably an extended period of instability. So sorry to leave us on a downer note, but as I've said in the past, I think it's clear that, you know, this civilization is over, but at least that gives us the joy of building something different out of the ruins of it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, McKenzie. The roaring applause of our virtual auditorium here, I want to convey. Orlando.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much for this wonderful talk. I am interested in so many things you said. Let me see. Let's just start by your very, I think that very timely and useful use of this non-ecology and non-politics. And I love this twist you gave to this idea of ecology while trying to replace it with nature. Again, trying to pay attention to nature, but I know that you're not talking about this nature that is external to humanity, that this nature that is just an abstract concept, and how you are so well aware of the perils of naturalization, right? The naturalization of other undesirable practices, undesirable when it comes to the possibility of surviving in this planet even. And I really would like to connect that with this return of the figure of nature with what you said about the need of some sort of natural science Marxism at this moment. I think that humanities are so isolated and arrogant in this sense that they think they inherited some kind of Heideggerian worldview where everything is an embodiment of this evil technological will to power that is as monolithic as the categories they are trying to deconstruct. While what we need now is I think that is the opposite. It's a very cooperative and comradely, as you said, conversation with the natural sciences, something that you recuperated through Bogdanov, through Plekhanov, through Mach, through Imperial Monism, and I think that that's something very extremely important in this moment, because there is this divorce in the humanities between some sort of philosophical neo-left Marxism or the natural sciences. I am really interested in that, and I was wondering if you were also when you said that you. I love when you said that you tend to associate ecologies with these ideas of homeostasis, right? Of this equilibrium that is being disrupted either by its own internal forces or by time or by the forces of capitalism, as you work so well in Molecular Red, the notion of metabolic rift. And here, I mean, I would like to bring again this idea of metabolism, right? Try to bring this to the question, because you mentioned labor. What I love about your work, I remember when I read your work, it was in a reading group called Marxist Education Project with my friends Fred Murphy and Steve Knight, and they introduced me to your book, and then I was so impressed precisely because it was the first book I read. I mean, I encountered where I could see metabolism seen from a labor perspective. I mean, nature seen from a labor perspective, and this issue of metabolism as this disruption of the process according to which what the waste or the product doesn't return to the producer itself, in this case nature, and how in these famous quotations of the labor on, sorry, the chapter on labor in Capital, precisely Marx defines metabolism work, sorry, as this independent imposed nature condition that is independent of society and independent of history, right? In this sense, it is an asymmetrically larger set of forces that unconditionally affect human life. And in this sense, I think that could be connected to your search for what I loved. I mean, this idea of nature without ecology, in this sense, nature without homeostasis, nature itself as traversed by a continuous process of rifts and or as Jason Moore would say, shifts, or as Thomas Nail would say, drifts, shifting rifts, no? I mean, all these processes that basically mean a tearing and opening apart of this nature. Another thing connected to that is one you immediately mentioned, Lucretius, right? The Rerum Natura and the Marx's doctoral dissertation. That connects me with one of my main obsessions with it, which is the dualism of matter and form. Basically, in my book, I'm not going to talk about my book here, but I just want to mention how this Aristotelian notion of a divine artisan that is God, that is positioned in front of an imperfect matter that needs to impress transcendent forms, pre-existing forms over matter, is what basically was the backbone of colonial extractivism in the 16th century America. This idea that things should be molded and transformed into something else. Well, precisely that is one of the ideas that Marx is discussing in Lucretius' Rerum Natura, right? He's trying to dismantle this opposition of matter and form, and to show how the swerve and how the clinamen is not different from the vacuum, and it's not different from the atom, and discreteness doesn't pre-exist these mechanical laws, right? And I think that could be also really cool when we think about this nature without ecology, that you might be thinking along those same lines. And I know that you, in your own work on information, you are also very focused on this idea of form, of a form of information that is basically exceeding the commodity form, and how you distrust this fetishistic belief in the all-explaining power of the commodity form over everything rest, as if there was some kind of theological agency to capital. So I think that we could talk about those things. I find it really interesting, because it basically goes back to a naturalistic Marx that doesn't fall into easy naturalism, right? That doesn't naturalize these socially installed practices. Then also, I was very interested in what you said about non-politics, right? And well, I was celebrating and cheering when you said that you distrusted social constructivism. I really think that social constructivism is over, that these ideas of everything is culture, everything is political, everything is, I mean, there is even a tendency to think in terms of turns, where there is first a linguistic turn, and then a cultural turn, and then a political turn, and then there is even an ontologization of these terms, right? There is an ontologization of politics when, and as you said, that is totally useless within academy, because it doesn't have any purchase power. And then what we get is this mystical realm of the political, I mean, which is, I think, that nothing but transcendentalism, right? Looking for the meta, ultra, transcendental condition of possibility behind the condition of possibility behind the condition of possibility, so showing how all these postures are just some fragile balance between what you want to say and declare and what you don't want to say and what you want to keep for granted, in this sense, right? Even if you have to gaslight it under the name of the non-politics that is a condition of politics, right? And that reminds me, I mean, when you mention also this idea of this divorce between war and politics, but there is a figure of Carl Schmitt, right? I mean, this idea of the friends and enemies, and Derrida's politics of friendship, and how this offshoot of Carl Schmitt is an attempt to bring both together in a way. I don't know if we could talk about that. I am not a fan of Carl Schmitt at all, or even the discussions opened by Carl Schmitt. I'm more on the side of talking about this other more productive, from my perspective, metabolic exchange between form and matter, or nature and culture. But that is something that we could take into consideration when talking about this non-politics, right? Also, what I want to celebrate is your return to base, go back to basics, go back to base. I mean, and how in your own career you distrusted this post-Althusserian search for some autonomous realm of politics or autonomous realm of the culture, trying to sever this from this other material condition forces and relations, as you say, what is considered vulgar, right? Messy and vulgar. And this is something that I think it's so much needed. But I mean, there is something I want to say about this, that maybe the notion of the ecological or the ecological in this sense could be recuperated. Also, I'm thinking in terms of this Linnaeus distinction between economy as nature, right? This idea of ecology as an economy of nature. And I was always captivated by this common prefix, like the eco that has a different logic and a different nomos, a different nomic register, right? And how this eco is split into like economic forces on the one hand and ecological forces on the other hand, that where it should be nature. And I am tempted to put there what you call the inhuman as this negotiation between always changing and always mutable negotiation between the human and the non-human, this inhuman, messy, changing, mutable, historical realm where we can articulate and disarticulate these two conflicting positions between economic interest right now and ecological, soon to be catastrophe, maybe, I don't know. So yes, I mean, this going back to this base, but I assume that your own notion of base is not something just declaring that we should go back to some deterministic superstructure, but trying to free this idea of humanity as a species being, trying to free it from any preconceived forms or preconceived transcendent forms, right? Finally, techniques, right? Yes, I mean, I think that there's so much to say here, because this is what I find so captivating about this primacy of technique, which is also a primacy of labor. I mean, it reminds me, first of all, it reminds me of this metaphor I was telling you about this divine artisan that imposes its own forms and preconceived forms over this imperfect material, chaotic material, right? But something that is always haunting me, I don't know what you think about this, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is how in this metaphor there is always a transference, a transposition from the realm of techniques to the realm of nature. I mean, then they said, well, nature works precisely as a divine artisan, therefore it is rational, therefore it has ends, therefore we have to subjugate these peoples, therefore we have to basically correct women, nature, and colonies, right? So I am always, I can't just embrace technique in the same way you do. Although I see, obviously, that technique is intimately connected to this labor perspective, there's something in there that makes me fall in some kind of loop where the naturalization of technique is also sometimes part of the problem, not always, but sometimes it is part of the problem. But I celebrate your own inversions of McLuhan, for instance, with this idea of technique being as a prosthesis, an extension of humanity, and how you show the opposite, that humanity itself is an effect of some kind of originary technique, as deconstructionists would say, and this primacy of the artifactual when making humans, right? Making humans in nature. But the way you phrase it is always so attentive, even when one reads you or when one listens to you, how you always find a way to, by the end of the sentence, to reintroduce some kind of reconnection with nature, with going back to this other material base, with what I would call like the metabolic moment, right? The metabolic exchange between both. So that is something that I find really fascinating, because I think that your attempt to define this, basically, what I love about this is the spirit of this kind of agenda, right? In other words, we know that if we just keep within the realm of this, of the aporias and loops and traps of phenomenology and conscience, and this, once we get into this spiral, we never get out, right? But it doesn't mean that there is no spiral. It only means that the spiral is messy, and the spiral is connected to another spiral that is larger, and that is the way I understand your going back to this idea of nature, right? It's not your nature is not a substance. Your nature is not a thing. Your nature is not Kant's noumenal sublime. Your nature is not even the nature of Lovecraft's weird fiction, right? When there is this different entity that comes from another planet to invade us and is totally against our own interests, as now is so fashionable to read, right? I mean, your nature is something totally different. It's something messy. It's something that we have to take into consideration, but it's always already inseparable from practice and from historical materialism, from something that needs to be done. Nature is not an entity in this sense. It's part of a larger assemblage of metabolic exchange. And I think I'm going to stop there, because there were like 2 or 3 points I wanted to touch, and that's it for the moment.
Thank you very much, Orlando. At this point, we have roughly 20-25 minutes for questions. Also, McKenzie, if you'd like to reply to Orlando, by all means. I would recommend, though, being brief, because otherwise it's going to be a reply and reply and reply and reply. We should go with that question.
Let's not do that. Yeah, let's have other people have a little time. Like, there's things I could pick up, but maybe there's other voices.
Wonderful, thank you. Romina, I think you and I are going to watch the chat, if that's okay. And feel free to type questions. While folks are looking for inspiration for questions, I'm going to maybe do one tiny comment, if I may. I want to highlight the power of negation here, of inversion, and of fine conceptual work. When this invitation went out, and you know, we have agreed as a group to discuss political ecology during this year, it seemed like we had found a solution. And I think that this discussion, Mackenzie's talk, Orlando's response, reminds us that we stumbled upon a problem, a real problem, right? And it's really salutary to take with a grain of salt these terms, even the coupling, you know, before it becomes a thing, and it's too late to backtrack and think critically about this. I think that the gesture of bringing us back to the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, when thinking about the Anthropocene, is more than you know, a boutade. I think that's there's something really serious to recover there. I quoted in our earlier meeting this year a conversation I had with Arturo Escobar, where he said, "Oh, it's great that you guys are thinking about decentering the human," and then he said, "Decentering the modern human." That was his point of emphasis, right? Because indeed, there are different trajectories, different teleologies, and different rapports between humans and non-humans that we should never, you know, quite forget. I have some points, but I want to make room for folks to ask them. So I'll touch on them, but feel free to please interject also, Jimena and Romina and everyone on the chat. I also like to see the linguistic turn mobilized in this discussion, surprisingly perhaps, but the reading of the board as someone who takes us from politics to war also takes war as a bit of a floating signifier and puts it to good use. And also you qualify this, McKenzie, by saying, as folks who have not experienced war, right? I would also add a dimension to that linguistic deployment, which is image. You mentioned also in connection to this idea that Black Panthers. The Black Panthers for us today are mediated through images. There's actually a wonderful exhibit at Stanford of photographies of the Black Panther Party. People should check it out. I'm thinking of Agnès Varda's documentary against something like Judas and the Black, what is it called? And the Black Messiah, Judas and the Black Messiah, right? When you compare those two, there's something about the effect of Agnès Varda's image that retains the war politics there. You know, just a perhaps minor point, but on the question of reinscribing techniques and how not thinking about techniques is something of an aristocratic morality at work. I am reminded of, you know, perhaps I'll toot my own horn just a tiny bit here, an argument I've made about calling things sweet. Calling things sweet and thinking that that is great is also an aristocratic, you know, morality at work there, because the rote labor involved in cultivating sugar and producing sugar is nothing but, it's not sweet at all. So it's funny that that word is codified in those positive terms. So again, it's interesting. We're working with the linguistic turn, even though we are in a company of new materialists. I'll make one tiny point and then ask a question. The tiny point is I also don't want us to go from an agreement on political ecology to an agreement on non-politics and non-ecology. I think it's important that we disagree. And I'm, you know, thinking that maybe later in the series, we should have a you know, very persuaded Badiou scholar, right? There's a new book by Badiou that Stanford University Press is publishing. A wonderful new translation by Bruno Bostiels. Several interlocutors here are in that more speculative leftism vein that we shouldn't, I think, be too quick to dispel, right? So I would like to hear, you know, the Badiouian counter perspective. Okay, now a question. Yes, homeostasis, problematic, also conservative. How about thinking about metamorphosis? I guess the question would be, McKenzie and perhaps Orlando, if there is something there, if we want to suspend this excessive credence on homeostasis, this default conservative agenda, how can we think about something like metamorphosis, also present in Lucretius, by the way? And I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the swerve, right? That we have a kind of naturalism without determinism in Lucretius, which is a kind of a beautiful thing. Yeah, yeah, so much to pick up. I mean, linguistic turn, as I recall it, had a kind of centering of language. And a kind of delight in the impossibility of an exteriority to it, or that the exteriority was to language was only ever registrable on the inside of it. And it's interesting that we've sort of moved back to the precursor to that, which was kind of phenomenologies of embodiment as a way to get out of it. I've been reading Merleau-Ponty, and I kind of like, why wasn't I doing this back in the day? This actually seems more helpful to me than that sort of centering of language. And as sort of people specializing in language, philosophies that center it seemed particularly appealing. And that was where my kind of Nietzschean instinct, kind of kicked in. It's like, what's the will to power involved in making language so central when language just happens to be the thing that we actually do? Yeah, so I'd sort of think about that one. I mean, Badiou is a communist, but not a Marxist. So there's no need to discuss Badiou in the frame of Marxist thought, because I see him as external to it. There's a way that you move from Althusser's relative autonomy of the superstructures to centering the category of politics as the only category, in a sense, which is fine, but it belongs in another space, and it's maybe a little specific to the Jacobin style of a certain kind of Maoist-inflected French Marxism that's a little bit different to anything I ever wanted to do. There's the thing about the critique of vulgar Marxism by, we could only call them genteel Marxists, I think, if we're structuralists, the existence of vulgar Marxism, as the meme has it, presupposes the existence of genteel Marxism. The thing that struck me about that is the lack of curiosity about the base. It was always about how somebody else was privileging the base too much, and we need to do something more sophisticated, without sort of thinking, actually, maybe the interface of labor and techniques with what then retrospectively appears as a nature is incredibly complicated and sophisticated and rich, and we could spend a lot more time and figuring out things like extraction, colonialism, like how science is involved in those things and so on. So yeah, it sort of struck me that the attempt to get out of vulgar Marxism always posited it as simplifying, and often it was, and often vulgar Marxisms were the things that you learn in party school because you're really going off to organize something. You're not going to do scholarship based on it. But if you were to, then maybe you could have a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of all of those interactions, and they might turn out to be really interesting. What would be a kind of conceptual approach to the question of information, which actually does give you that whole problem of matter and form, right? Information and form are related etymologically, and we're living in, kind of a world of hyper Aristotelian theories in which information and matter are absolutely separate, and one dominates and controls the other on a planetary scale. So how would you incorporate information as a series of techniques and scientific discoveries in a way of thinking that doesn't make it external to and controlling of matter? Like, that strikes me as a very 21st century and very pressing problem to which we don't really have answers. And Marx's work predates information as a science. There are sciences we kind of have to have some dialogue with and interface with to bring Marxism into the 21st century. Information science is one, and what happened in the life sciences after molecular biology and genetics is another. It's like, how do we think those things? Harrow, for example, gives you a piece of that. So yeah, I don't want to respond to all of these things, but just to throw a couple of things in there. And there is a question from Aaron in the chat. Shall I have a look at that?
I was going to ask you whether you wanted to read it out loud.
Yeah, I can read that. Yeah, I don't go by Ken anymore, by the way. You never once mentioned Norbert Wiener in Molecular Red. No, and it's dealing with an earlier time period. Yet in finding Bogdanov, you found an older ancestor for a collective systems theory. Do you think if you had to revisit your gamer theory after Molecular Red, you might add a chapter about games and system theory? Do you think, that's a fascinating idea, do you think games might be useful vehicle intervention for dealing in both what is possible and also in the job of educating the base on possible strategies for surviving the collapse of civilization? Also was finding Bogdanov a détournement of Wiener and the educational institutions that rely on his work and hold a certain cachet and dominance in the narrative. In the context of what you are talking about, could games be a form of praxis? That's a new form of politics. I can connect that to something Orlando mentioned, which is an alternate version of war is politics, which is in Schmitt. Yeah, like the political is the friend-enemy relation. and I always immediately want to do things with that. Like, doesn't it require a third? Like, isn't there always a third? So if in the friend-enemy relation, you were to totally dominate the enemy, who's there to recognize your victory? Like, it's not a victory anymore. And that's why I think people don't read Huizinga enough. Like, Homo Ludens opens with Huizinga distancing what he's going to do with play from both Schmidt and Marx, and that he was writing this right on the eve of World War II makes it an astonishing book. And for Huizinga, play is war, among other things, sublimated into forms of contests, Eliotry, elaboration, and so forth. So I think I'd really love to see Huizinga back in dialogue, because there's a whole other version of Marxism that centers play instead of work, and I'm interested in that through the Situationists. And there's a way that play is a way of not talking about politics, but talking about forms of war that don't involve murder, that don't involve killing. And that gives you a way to kind of think, for example, pedagogy, for example, ways of simulating where what we know of what's likely to happen to climate, you know, to push a little too hard maybe, comes from games, right? Comes from simulations. Climate science is a simulation science. It's a game-based science, yeah. So yeah, it wouldn't hurt to, given that there are whole populations whose dominant media form is the game, to think that through a little bit in terms of educational practice of how you connect to that. I wrote Game of Theory in dialogue with the sort of avant-garde of game design of maybe around, you know, late 90s, early into this century. And I think that's sort of, there's a useful set of pedagogic tools there. And it's no accident that Guy Debord wanted to pass on a lesson about strategy and tactics and their reversibility through a game as much as through the texts. So I think Debord's game, which is a little hard to play, so we could maybe improve on that, but it does have a particular view of tactics and strategy as reversible. I think that's the particular concept in that. Yeah. So, and Wiener's a fascinating character, and I wanted to do a book on post-war left sciences, but I think I was gonna do mostly sort of biological sciences rather than information sciences. But I think there's sort of like a chunk of attempts at kind of left engagement with science as a set of, no such thing as science, but sciences as ways of generating knowledges, that we sort of lost the thread off a little bit, which is connected to, like, how did Heidegger become respectable? And a thing that people who imagine they're not Nazis kind of just borrow from freely. Like, it still just boggles my mind. There's an entire erased cadre of Marxist thinkers that you never get to learn about, and not even on reading lists. But that guy, and then where you end up with this technics as total externality, yeah, as a kind of ontological mistake, which Heidegger can only know through a technics, right? Like through the techniques of writing. You produce this theory that exempts one, and you call it thinking when it's not, right? We have no access to that. Anyway, one could go on.
Other questions, reactions? We can expect you know, a colloquium on genteel Marxism any day now. We have a title and we have a research agenda. I was inspired, here's a bit of a tangent before we get to Alejo's question, to have for you know, Stanford grad students who might be interested, a field trip for humanists to visit server farms and the library annex. And I am dead serious here, because your point, McKenzie, of disinterest for the base, I could not, you know, agree with it more. It's quite important. On the connections, if people were bewildered about, you know, gaming and political ecology, right? You might want to look at Richard Powers' The Overstory. It's a little on the nose, that novel, but the thing it does with the Stanford campus and with the quad in particular in connection to gaming is worth dwelling upon. Similarly, the Black Panther Party, again, there is an interview in Agnès Varda's documentary with a very young man, he's probably 16, who says, the Black community, this is Oakland 1968, is not a reading community. This is why we go out and explain, and then we act together. That kind of politics, really hard to reproduce in other contexts, and really, keen. That it's kind of like vanguardia intelectual in the Guevara sense, because Guevara was an inspiration, but with a twist, something to maybe think about another time. Let me read Alejo's question, McKenzie. I'll save you the reading out loud. Could McKenzie help us clarify the relation between techniques, labor, and practice? Practice tends to have a philosophical genealogy that Marx takes up in the earlier works, the thesis and 1844 manuscripts, for example, before the break. Sorry, perhaps a recovering Althuserian here as well. But then, nothing wrong with that, I don't think. But then this appears.
I'm also in AA, Althuserians Anonymous.
AA, I love that. Okay, that's the second colloquium we're having. Okay. But then this appears in the scientific works, in which the concept of labor and labor power becomes central. Today, it appears as if practice has overtaken the concept of labor. Wow. We speak even after Isabel Stenger, of an ecology of practices, in which case the primacy of labor rather than of practice seems crucial to recover if we are to account for the shifting patterns of accumulation of capital, platform capitalism, etc. The question, what kinds of alliances do you see today? A politics of the encounter, as the Zapatistas ask for, would call for an encounter between practices, scientific, artistic, ellipses. Thank you, Alejo. Okay.
Oh, and thank you for politics of the encounter, because I haven't thought about Zapatistas in a while, but that's a sort of useful, it would transpose that into a kind of different realm. And thank you for that. And also for sort of decentering my sources for things tend to be Western. I'm a, displaced modern, I guess. Yeah, I'm not and never was a Hegelian. So there is that Marxist Hegelian model of praxis that's maybe still lingering in Lukács and Gramsci and so on, maybe to sort of move a little bit beyond. And there's already a kind of fascinating critique of that in Sartre's critique of political reason and Merleau-Ponty's Adventures in Dialectic, with that realization of like, wait, like the dialectic isn't, it's massively incapable of moving the world in the way that was once imagined. And Sartre's concept of practico inert really captures that. And a term that he uses only occasionally in the margins of that text and is inertia, of the kind of inertia one strikes in relation to the practico inert, that there's no reciprocity involved in praxis, and theories of praxis then still have that Aristotelian residue of form being imposed on matter via labor. A little bit that lingers in Bogdanov too, which I didn't stress that, but there's limits to Bogdanov's thinking around that as well. So yeah, I think to think practices firstly a little bit more empirically rather than leaping to having a kind of a concept of it, and to differentiate them, which Bogdanov was already doing, and Bogdanov was already trying to think of how does specific sets of concepts emerge as substitutions. You substitute out of a labor process you're in onto the universe, so you start to see the whole world as in the same shape as the thing you do. Like those computer scientists who decided the entire universe is a simulation. It makes perfect sense because that's what you do. Yeah, the universe is computation. Well, obviously, because you're substituting for the particular practice onto the universe. So to do a kind of empirical study, it would have a practice of studying practices and engaging with other practices. And I think that's essentially what I'm suggesting in sensorial and general intellects is, oh, is there a practice of engaging with practices such that we could not come up with a unifying theory of them, but come up with a practice that they can relate to each other and not impose a sort of universalizing model on them. So maybe that's way of thinking encounter in a slightly different context here. Yeah, now what else is, yeah, I think there is a break in Marx. I think it's got more to do with moving away from Hegel towards engagements with scientific materialism of post-48 Germany. I'm not a specialist in that, but this is where metabolic rift comes from, is Marx's reading agronomy, reading Justus von Liebig and going, wait, what, there's a whole way in which what the commodification of agriculture did was like literally move phosphorus from one place to another and create this kind of agricultural problem and hence Liebig's law of the minimum, you know, like whatever is the scarcest necessary input for a plant to grow is the limit to how much it can grow. Central concept for how Bogdanov thinks how systems work and how they collapse and so on. Yeah. So yeah, I think there is a kind of a break. It's maybe not quite where Althusser wanted it to be. I'm not interested in philologically how provable these propositions are, and I don't think Althusser was either. You know, like Althusser's break is political in origin. It's an argument within the party. And how do we, you really have to, with some of these thinkers, situate them back in the context of the party and the labor movement to understand some of these moves. They start to seem a little different in a grad school context if you're not aware that you know, like Althusser's moves are all, you know, kind of tracing a path through the PCF in a particular moment in time, and which isn't ours, right? So maybe we need tactically to be looking at different branches of the Marxist legacy rather than sort of taking this inheritance, given that we need different intellectual tactics. I think that covers most of the things in it, yeah? Yeah, so let's separate practice from that sort of universalizing model. I think a plurality of them. Bogdanov was starting to do that. He's in the footnotes of people beginning to do sociology of knowledge, for example. Yeah, and then what was as a kind of politics of knowledge. I hesitate to use the word politics or knowledge, but maybe that's a way of grasping, you know, what for us situated in universities and hopefully being able to make alliances outside them, like that's the political problem. Yeah, like we're subject to managerial regimes who've figured out that, oh, we're information workers like all the others, so we can be subject to the same regimes of control. Now, how do we get out from under that? Well, we will have to get better at politics, but it won't be the political. It'll be having, you know, cadre skills.
Yeah, which cannot be built in grad seminars, not every grad seminar.
No, absolutely not. And that's, you know, the benefit of constant eruption of social movements is immersion of people in, you know, seminars that in a university would take the 15 weeks. But when you're involved in a social movement, the seminar can be compressed into a weekend, you know.
Thank you very much, McKenzie and Orlando. At this point, what I'd like to do is pass it over to my co-chair, Jimena Briceño, to close the formal portion, and then we'll stay on after hitting the recording button and just chat. Jimena.
Microphone, of course. I had previously problems with the camera, now I have problems with my microphone. But I just wanted to thank you both so much. I think this was really illuminating, and I think that we will have to keep thinking about plurality of practices and the problem of naturalization, I think both in politics and in nature. In terms of an encounter of practices, I'm really happy to share with the group that this will be the third event of Materia this quarter will be a continuation of that, because we will have our Peruvian artist Sandra Gamarra and archaeologist Mary Weismantel come to discuss Moche artifacts. Mary has a book that just came out, and it's entitled Playing with Things, Engaging with Moche Sex Spots. And Sandra has been presenting very interesting works of art that deal with the same objects. So it would be fascinating to see how they both can have a conversation about the ecology of those objects and the politics of those objects, or the non-ecology and the non-politics of those objects. So I just wanted to say that so that people know that we have that coming. And I think that we are going to stay on Zoom, but without the recording. Is that right? Excellent.
Thank you again.